Into this edition of Revealing Prophecy, where we talk about the headlines from around the world and their prophetic significance. This is a weekly digest, and I receive multiple digests from various sources, and I do a digest of the digest, highlighting some 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe even 9 stories, depending on the time, as to what has some significant commentary, significant impact to the prophetic landscape and God's timetable for these end of end days. Very exciting times as we're less than 2 weeks away from the midterm elections here in the West. Israel has elections coming up on November the 1st. All our eyes are glued on these two very pivotal races going on here in America and in Israel, and the future of our relationships, what's going on in China, what's going on in Russia, what's going on with North Korea. And with Putin being in Iran, meeting with Erdogan this week, we know that these events, or maybe it was last week, are very significant, and the rhetoric coming out is extraordinary. So let us get into today's stories. Of course, this is Igniting a Nation. You can visit us at https. Make sure that S is on there. It's a secure website, https://ignitinganation.com. If you want to visit our store, just go /store. If you want to make a donation, you can make a donation right there on the donate page. You can set up a recurring credit card donation or a recurring check from your bank right there on the website. And any changes that you want to make to any of your payments that you currently have pending with us or scheduled with us can be done right from there. If you have any problems, please just use the contact form on the website and contact me, and I will assist you as best I can. So for our first story, this brought to us by Michael Snyder from the Economic Collapse blog. It's dated October 20th, that's 6 days ago. This article is entitled, "This is going to be a winter like no other." It is starting to get cold outside. Are you ready for a winter that will be unlike any other? As Michael Snyder has been documenting on the Economic Collapse blog for months, the nightmarish global energy crisis that has erupted is not going to end anytime soon. In fact, it has the potential to get a whole lot worse in 2023 and beyond. Energy prices have already risen to absolutely absurd levels, and now winter is coming. Unfortunately, many forecasters are warning that this winter is going to be a doozy. Colder than normal temperatures are expected across much of the northern hemisphere. And if that actually happens, that would put a tremendous amount of strain on the infrastructure and the system. For example, just look at what New England is potentially facing. According to the Wall Street Journal, residents of the 6 states which make up the region could actually experience rolling blackouts if this turns out to be a really cold winter. New England, which relies on natural gas imports to bridge winter supply gaps, is now competing with European countries for shipments of liquefied natural gas following Russia's halt of most pipeline gas to the continent. Severe cold spells in the Northeast could reduce the amount of gas available to generate electricity as more of it is burned to heat homes. The region's power grid operator, ISO New England, has warned that an extremely cold winter could strain the reliability of the grid and potentially result in the need for rolling blackouts to keep electricity supply and demand in balance. The warning comes as executives and analysts predict power producers could have to pay as much as several times more than last year for gas deliveries if severe weather creates urgent need for spot market purchases. New England will likely be directly competing with the EU for dwindling supplies of natural gas this winter. Unfortunately, there's probably not going to be enough to go around. Europeans have been urged to conserve energy for months, but much of the population is not heeding those warnings. As a result, many EU countries could also be facing blackouts in the months ahead. The EU could face blackouts this winter as the continent faces an ongoing energy crisis amid Russia's war in Ukraine. But Brussels is preparing for worst-case scenarios, according to EU Crisis Management Commissioner Janez Lenarčič. asked in an interview published Tuesday by Germany's R&D media network whether EU countries would need disaster relief due to the energy crisis, Lenarchik responded, "Yes, that is quite possible. If the power is completely shut off where you live for several hours on one of the coldest days of the year, what will you do? You might want to start thinking about that." In Ukraine, much of the country is without power right now. The Russians have started to systematically go after the nation's power grid, and at this point, approximately 30% of all Ukrainian power stations are not functioning. Blackouts have struck more than 1,000 towns and villages in Ukraine after a series of Russian attacks. The Kremlin has killed more than 70 people in the past fortnight after ordering rockets and drone strikes on Ukrainian cities. President Volodymyr Zelensky said 30% of Ukraine's power stations have been knocked out in the blitz. Sections of Kyiv have been left without water and power following further blasts today. The Russians can completely destroy the Ukrainian power grid if they wish to do so. Will they go that far? Needless to say, the weather is already starting to get really cold in some parts of Ukraine, and we're being warned that a long-term lack of power could result in an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. World Health Organization Regional Director for Europe, Hans-Henri Kluge, said at the media briefing that the organization is working to anticipate and prepare for the challenges of the approaching brutal winter in its humanitarian response to Russia's war on the country. Kluge remarked that risk of COVID-19, frostbite, hypothermia, pneumonia, stroke, and heart attack will likely increase among Ukrainians who are living precariously, whether in substandard shelters without access to heating or by regularly moving to different locations. The author, Michael Snyder, says he got chills just reading those two paragraphs. It's starting to get cold here in the United States as well. In fact, some cities near the Great Lakes just received more than a foot of snow. The cold front has seen freeze alerts issued for more than 89 million Americans in states in its path, already offering rounds of snow, rain, and high-speed winds in the Great Lakes. More than 13 inches of snowfall recorded in cities near lakes such as Ironwood and Marquette, as well as up to 4 inches in nearby Minnesota and Wisconsin. Are we being warned that the coldest air, and we are being warned that the coldest air of the season is now hitting the South? We just experienced that last week. The coldest air of the season so far had the South in its grip, and near freezing temperatures set near record lows across a wide swath of the region late last week. AccuWeather meteorologists have been tracking a powerful disturbance since last week as it swept out of Canada and into the central and eastern United States. While the storm continues to bring the first snowflakes of the season to parts of the Midwest and Northeast, areas further south will be in line for a dose of cold air that some may not be accustomed to handling so early in the season. It already feels like winter for tens of millions of Americans, but the official beginning of winter is still more than 2 months away. That is not a good sign. For years, Michael Snyder has been urging his readers to become less dependent on the power grid, but up until now, being independent of the power grid hasn't been a problem. However, now things are changing in a major way. Energy prices are absolutely skyrocketing, and officials all over the globe are warning of blackouts this winter. I hope that you get prepared ahead of time, because this winter is going to be exceedingly challenging for millions upon millions of people all around the globe. This is a sign of the human toll of these prophetic times. We tend to think that the period leading up to the tribulation will be a volatile period of wars and rumors of wars, of famine and pestilence in diverse places, just as Messiah said. But these birth pains take the shape of hurricanes and tornadoes and cyclones and earthquakes, famine, pestilence, heat waves, freeze waves, and this energy situation where people buried their heads in the sand. America, for a period of time, was completely energy independent. Now we're out knocking on the doors of third world communist nations and terrorist-run countries for our energy supply. We're at a critical crossroads. Now, each one of us has a responsibility to make preparations. As you know, in preparing for the hurricane season, I've fitted my home with a generator, and that generator runs on propane. Now, propane will be in short supply. So prior to Hurricane Ian, I was able to stock up on propane, enough to last me for several weeks and for intermittent bursts of power as needed should there be any type of blackout or weather situation. You don't have to have a hurricane to experience power outages. In the remote part of this region where I live, power outages are something that I've become familiar with. So far this year, 8, 9, maybe 10 times, which encouraged me to go ahead and have my house outfitted with a transfer switch and a generator that I keep in my garage, and I can wheel out to my power panel and plug it in and have the entirety of my interior of my home fully electrified and producing electricity, all that I need from a 13,000 watt generator. This is something that I've done and will provide protection for neighbors and friends and family that need that protection to come into a warm or cool place, depending on the season. This is a part of ministry, preparing a place for people together, whether or not it's your church, it's your home, whatever you're doing, you have a significant prophetic impact on the lives that you touch in your community. And I want to encourage you to reach out to others who may be in need, to keep your eye on that neighbor that you think might be struggling, and reach out to them. Offer whatever assistance you can. We're all in this together, and we cannot delight in the downfall of other peoples. They're all God's creation, and our hope is that they would know the Messiah, and that whatever troubles they experience would only be temporary, but they would have the eternal promise that you and I have, that this is not our home. This is not our eternity. This is just a stopping place while we're passing through. But our trust is in the Lord. Our next story. Echoes of Gog and Magog. Tensions between Russia and Israel soar as top Putin ally threatens Moscow, ready to cut diplomatic relations with Jerusalem. Published a week ago today by Joel Rosenberg. A member of Russian President Vladimir Putin's inner circle of advisors threatened this week that Moscow is ready to sever diplomatic ties with Israel. The threat came via former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who publicly warned that any Israeli effort to supply arms to Ukraine would destroy all diplomatic relations between our countries. Israel appears to be getting ready to supply weapons to the Kyiv regime. Medvedev wrote Tuesday on Telegram, the social media platform. A very reckless move, he wrote. It would destroy all bilateral relations between our countries. Medvedev is currently the deputy head of the Russian Security Council. On Sunday, Israeli Diaspora Affairs Minister Nachman Shai wrote on Twitter that due to Iran reportedly transferring ballistic missiles to Russia for use in the Ukraine war, there was no longer any doubt where Israel should stand in this bloody conflict, the Israeli news site Ynet reported. The time has come for Ukraine to receive military aid as well, just as the USA and NATO countries provide, Shai wrote. Why should this matter to Christians? Joel Rosenberg asks. This is the most tense moment that I can recall in Israeli relations with the Kremlin in decades. It's significant to many Bible-believing Christians and religious Jews for a very specific reason. The prophecies found in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, foretell a day when Russia, Gog, and its dictator Magog will build an alliance with Persia, Iran, Gomer, Turkey, and other countries to turn against Israel and attack the Jewish state in the last days of history. While it's too early to draw any conclusions, geopolitical trends in recent years, indeed in recent months, are intriguingly consistent with the war of Gog and Magog prophecies. Some Christians are openly asking, is Vladimir Putin Gog? A question that Joel Rosenberg addressed in the debut of his new primetime TV show on TBN, The Rosenberg Report. Why is Israel walking such a fine line with Russia? For months, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his closest advisors have been urging Israel to sell them defensive weapons, particularly the Iron Dome and other technologies that would allow them to shoot down Russian missiles and Iranian-made suicide drones that Tehran has recently begun supplying Moscow. Israeli leaders have tried hard not to directly involve themselves in the conflict for several reasons. Why? Several reasons. First, Israel does not want to shift the ire of the Russian bear towards itself. Second, Israel needs Moscow's tacit approval, or at least Putin's blind eye, towards Israeli operations to attack and destroy Iranian weapon caches and bases in Syria. Third, Israel wants to protect the ability of the Jewish Agency to operate in Russia and thus facilitate any Russian Jewish person or family emigrating to Israel as the Russian economy suffers. Poverty rates soar and freedom of worship and expression continue to be curtailed. That said, Prime Minister Yair Lapid has made it clear that he personally sides with Ukraine and believes Putin is in the wrong by illegally invading Ukraine. We'll be on the right side of history, Lapid said back in February. The comments of both Medvedev and Shai were widely reported in Israel media and in Europe. In response to the escalating war of words, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz told European ambassadors that Israel won't be selling weapons to Ukraine, but adding that it could build the embattled country a civilian early warning system to warn of incoming strikes like the one used in Israel, reported the Times of Israel. Israel conducts a policy of supporting Ukraine through humanitarian support and the supply of life-saving systems and defensive equipment, Gantz said. However, I would like to emphasize that Israel will not transfer weapon systems to Ukraine due to a variety of operational considerations. We will continue to support Ukraine within our limitations, as we have done so far, he said. As part of the expansion of aid and the supply of life-saving equipment, after a conversation with representatives from Ukraine, we applied for data that would allow us to assist in the construction and supply of a smart alert system like there is in Israel against aerial and other threats, Gantz said. Such a system will have advantages both in saving civilian lives and in targeting alerts and alarms to the relevant areas, he said. You can follow Joel Rosenberg on his blog at joelrosenberg.com. You can also support his ministry there as well. We applaud the work that Joel is doing as they're relocating to Israel and being an ambassador to both Israel and to Arab countries as he is making overtures to world leaders to hear the biblical truth of prophecy and their particular parts in prophecy. So let there be no mistake. Israel is well aware of Scripture. The Israeli government is well aware of Scripture. The Bible is studied in Israel. The prophecies are studied. Benjamin Netanyahu held Bible studies in his home every weekend. This is not a country that's unfamiliar with the Bible. The Torah, the first 5 books, the law, the prophets, and the writing. They're quite familiar with it. Many of their battle tactics, many of their defense systems have been based and named David's sling. These are the kind of biblical references that we want to see a country exhibit. But they're well aware of the tensions, the known enemies that God has revealed, the attack on the Jewish people, both through anti-Semitism and the physical threat of annihilation, this cancel culture and this anti-Semitic rhetoric of this Kanye West and the world going crazy over these rampant anti-Semitic comments lets you know that evil is permeating the world at the highest levels, and those that support it are clearly not reading the same scriptures that you and I are. Our third story for this day, Iran's assistance to Russian war effort could make the country an enemy combatant, experts say. Iran's involvement can make it a party to alleged war crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine. Continued assistance to Russia in the form of drones and weapons could place Iran at risk of being considered an enemy combatant in Ukraine, a status that opens the country up to sharing responsibility for war crimes. With the potential for missiles to be transferred by Iran to Ukraine, one has to begin to consider the Islamic Republic as a combatant on the side of Russia in the Ukraine war. Foundation for Defense of Democracy senior fellow Behnam Ben Taleblu told Fox News Digital, indeed, if Iranian heavily armed suicide drones are striking Kyiv, then there's no room left to entertain the fiction that Iran is just a passive partner in this conflict. Taleblu's comments came after multiple reports over the last week indicated Iran has increased its assistance to the Russian war effort in Ukraine, including supplying Russian forces with suicide drones and surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps members, have also reported travel to Crimea to help train Russian forces on the use of the Iranian-made weapons, a move that signals deepening military ties between the two countries. That fact was confirmed by White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby on Thursday, who said the Iranians decided to move in some trainers and some technical support to help the Russians use them with better lethality. The information we have is the Iranians who put trainers and tech support in Crimea, but it's the Russians who are doing the piloting, Kirby told reporters. That's our assessment at this time. Aggressive regimes in Tehran and Moscow are increasingly dependent on each other because of the international backlash against their coercive foreign policies and imperial ambitions. James Phillips, a senior research fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation, told Fox News Digital, both have been heavily sanctioned as a result and cooperate to evade sanctions. Phillips noted that the two countries have also cooperated in Syria, where their militaries have joined forces to help keep Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in power. But Iranian cooperation with Russia and Ukraine could be even more problematic for the country, with reports surfacing that Iranian-made kamikaze drones have been used to strike targets around Kyiv, including civilian areas. The strikes were the most recent example of alleged war crimes Russia has committed in Ukraine, while using Iranian-supplied equipment to carry out the strikes could cause Iran to be considered at least partially responsible for the crimes. If Iranian personnel are launching and controlling the drones, or even just maintaining them for the Russians, then they should be considered combatants, Phillips said. At a minimum, they definitely are accomplices to Russian war crimes, since the Russians are using the drones to target civilians and civilian infrastructure. Russia's invasion of Ukraine largely cut the country off from much of the international community, forcing the Kremlin into partnerships with countries such as Iran and North Korea. Inconsistent results on the battlefield have complicated matters for Russian President Vladimir Putin, with the Russian military depleting stocks of munitions in an attempt to regain the initiative against emboldened Ukrainian forces. As a result, Russia has turned to its newfound partners for help in maintaining the war effort. It would be logical to consider Iran a party to the Russian-Ukrainian war, considering that the Islamic Republic provides lethal military hardware that helps Moscow kill Ukrainians. Rebecca Koffler, a former DIA intelligence officer and the author of Putin's playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America, told Fox News Digital. The same issue can be raised about North Korea, who has been supplying millions of artillery shells and rockets to the Russians. Putin has been assembling a coalition of international pariahs to help him plug some holes in his conventional weapons arsenal, as he's running short of his own precision strike missiles. Koffler noted that Russia already considers the U.S. and NATO as a party to the war, with the American-led alliance providing Ukraine with the lethal weapons it needs to sustain its defense against the invasion. However, an acknowledgement by the West that Iran is a combatant in the war would force the U.S. into revealing the true scope of the conflict. Once Washington acknowledged that Iran and North Korea are de facto enemy combatants on the side of the Kremlin, everyone will recognize the obvious. We are in an East versus West battle, Koffler said, and the battlefield is expanding beyond geographic borders and into cyber, economics, and other domains. Despite Iran's participation in the war in Ukraine, the White House has continued its effort to rekindle the Obama-era JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, though talks have recently stalled and a new agreement has become increasingly unlikely. The White House is still under the delusion that it can reach a nuclear deal with Iran, and Russia is a party to those talks, Koffler said. It's largely the same cast of characters, the Obama 2.0 crew, who were pushing a foolish reset policy with Russia when Joe Biden was the VP, as Putin was hashing his plan to resubjugate Ukraine and other post-Soviet states. Instead, Koffler argued that President Biden should be standing up a robust deterrence posture in developing counter-strategy. Part of the counter-strategy would typically include Saudi Arabia, a longtime security partner whose relationship with the U.S. has deteriorated under Biden's leadership. That fractured relationship came to a head last week when the Saudi-led OPEC Plus oil cartel opted to decrease production of oil despite pleas from the White House to ramp up production to help alleviate an energy crisis in the West. That move was not well received in Washington, where Biden and several lawmakers accused the oil-rich kingdom of siding with Russia in its war with Ukraine. The accusation was denied by Saudi Arabia, which claimed its motivations were purely for the economic benefit of OPEC Plus member states. Nevertheless, Biden has warned of consequences for Saudi Arabia and vowed to review the U.S. security relationship with the country, a move Phillips questioned among the administration's seemingly softer stance on Iran. While the Biden administration is threatening to punish Saudi Arabia for siding with Russia on oil prices, it's turned a blind eye to Iran's much more extensive cooperation with Moscow on oil prices, arms sale, Ukraine, and Syria, Phillips said. The administration should focus more on pushing back against adversaries on security issues and less on penalizing problematic friends on political issues such as high gas prices in the run-up to midterm elections. Many things going on here, all conflated by a government which is seemingly in chaos. Our foreign relations are at an all-time low. Our military is lower rated than many around the world. North Korea is launching weapons and have been threatened in a joint statement by the US, Japan, and South Korea that if it tests a nuclear weapon, it will have severe consequences. What could those consequences be? Are we not looking at a fuse and a president with a box of matches ready to light it? This is the prelude to the rising up of a leader out of the ashes of what? A dirty weapon, a dirty bomb, a nuclear explosion, an accident? If you don't think we're in the most prophetic times, we have not had this kind of Cold War nuclear threat scenario since I was a kid, hiding underneath a wooden desk to protect myself from nuclear fallout. They had us convinced that we were safe under those desks. We haven't learned much, have we? This next article, 5 signs that the war between Russia and NATO is about to spiral out of control, by our good friend Michael Snyder. Have you ever found yourself completely losing your temper in the middle of a heated struggle of some sort? Whether it's a hotly contested sporting event, an actual fist fight, or a bitter battle against an online foe, it can be way too easy to lose your temper. When tempers flare, you can end up losing control and doing things that you deeply regret later. Unfortunately, the same thing is true on an international level. Russia and NATO have become absolutely obsessed with winning in Ukraine, and leaders on both sides are getting angrier and angrier. And when leaders become extremely angry, they can do really stupid things. He writes, I have been extremely alarmed by some of the events that have transpired over the past week. Hotheads in Russia and hotheads in the Western world just continue to escalate the conflict in Ukraine, and we're getting dangerously close to a point of no return. The following are 5 signs that the war between Russia and NATO is about to spiral out of control. Number 1, a dirty bomb. There's been a lot of chatter about the possibility that Russia could start using tactical nukes in Ukraine. And now the Russians are alleging that the Ukrainians are preparing to detonate a dirty bomb in their own territory in order to motivate the Western powers to get even more involved in the conflict. Russia's defense chief on Sunday alleged that Ukraine was preparing a provocation involving a radioactive device, a stark claim that reflected soaring tensions as Moscow struggles to stem Ukrainian advances in the south and is building defensive positions in anticipation of Ukrainian offensives elsewhere. Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, made the allegations in phone calls with his counterparts from Britain, France, and Turkey. He also spoke to U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in their second call in 3 days, but a terse Russian readout of that call didn't say whether the dirty bomb claim was also mentioned in their conversation. Number 2, the United States 101st Airborne Division gets deployed to Eastern Europe. The 101st Airborne Division is one of the most famous units in the history of the United States military. And the writer was quite stunned to learn that they have just been deployed to Europe for the first time in almost 80 years. The U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division has been deployed to Europe for the first time in almost 80 years amid soaring tension between Russia and the American-led NATO military alliance. The light infantry unit, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, is trained to deploy on any battlefield in the world within hours, ready to fight. For now, the Screaming Eagles are involved in exercises near the Ukrainian border, but CBS News is reporting that they are prepared to cross the border into Ukraine if that becomes necessary. The Screaming Eagles commanders told CBS News repeatedly that they are always ready to fight tonight. And while they're there to defend NATO territory, if the fighting escalates or there's any attack on NATO, they're fully prepared to cross the border into Ukraine. This is news you're getting here. Maybe you've heard it elsewhere, maybe not. But things are escalating. And living in a military area where talks of deployment and where people are going is on every street corner. People are talking about it in the lines at the grocery store. They're talking about who's getting transferred to where. We see that deployments are already taking place and orders are already being issued. People are being mobilized. America is preparing for war. Number 3, 1 million rounds of ammunition. The United States has never armed anyone like they're arming the Ukrainians. If you can believe it, we've already given Ukraine over 1 million rounds of howitzer ammunition since the beginning of the war. The U.S. has now provided Ukraine with over 1 million rounds of howitzer ammunition since it began shipping arms to the embattled nation to aid its fight against Russia, according to the latest figures from the Defense Department. That includes up to 903,000 standard 155 millimeter howitzer rounds, as well as 3,000 M982 Excalibur guided rounds, 7,000 remote anti-armor mine systems, ROMS projectiles, and 180,000 105 millimeter howitzer shells. It appears that much more help was soon on the way. Right now, a new aid package is being readied in Congress, which would give the Ukrainians another $50 billion in assistance. The new aid package, which most likely would be part of an omnibus spending bill, could be within the range of roughly $50 billion, congressional aides and a source close to the Ukrainian government said. The 4th sign, Iranian troops in Ukraine. A lot of mercenaries from Western nations have been fighting alongside the Ukrainians for a long time. And now the U.S. is alleging that Iranian troops have actually entered Ukraine and are directly engaged on the ground in an effort to help the Russians. Iranian troops are directly engaged on the ground in Crimea, supporting Russian drone attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure and civilian population, the White House has said. The U.S. government has confirmed that Russian attacks have employed unmanned aerial vehicles purchased from Tehran and attacks carried out against Ukrainian targets from bases on the peninsula that Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said. This conflict in Ukraine is becoming more of a world war with each passing day. We know that the Russians have been using Iranian drones to strike targets all over Ukraine in recent days. And that should deeply trouble all of us. Speaking of Iran, I just learned that their military has been conducting large-scale military drills on its border with Azerbaijan. Iran's military is conducting large-scale military drills on its border with Azerbaijan, including practicing crossings of the Aras River, which defines a large part of the border between the two states. The exercises, called Mighty Iran, began on October 17th. The exact location has not been specified, but Iranian media placed them in between Iran's province of Ardabil and East Azerbaijan, the part of Iran across the Aras from Azerbaijan's Fuzili region. One expert on open source intelligence, however, analyzed photos of the pontoon crossing and placed it across from Azerbaijan's enclave of Nakhchivan. The Iranians have been getting really aggressive lately, and I have a feeling that the direct conflict between Iran and Israel will begin sooner rather than later. And number 5, relentless bombing of power infrastructure. The Russians have decided to take off the gloves. They've started relentlessly bombing electrical infrastructure all over Ukraine, and this threatens to create a major humanitarian crisis because winter is rapidly approaching. Missiles and drones are being used to rain down upon key civilian infrastructure targets, mainly power stations, as the weather gets colder and days get darker. It's believed Russia hopes by doing so they may be able to make Kyiv lose hope and give up the defense of their homeland. Kirilo Timoshenko, a key advisor to President Vladimir Zelensky, confirms that there are now an estimated 1.5 million people without power across Ukraine. Both sides just continue to escalate matters, and it's just a matter of time before someone pushes things a little bit too far. Even now, it's really difficult to see a peaceful way out of this mess. The Biden administration seems to be completely opposed to any peace talks with the Russians, and this writer believes that this is a tragic mistake. If both sides just continue to get angrier, at some point, someone is going to be really tempted to resort to nuclear weapons. And once that happens, our world will never be the same. Unfortunately, our leaders don't seem to understand that we could literally be on the brink of a nuclear conflict. They're so determined to win this current battle on the global chessboard that they can't even see the bigger picture. Sadly, we've reached a stage where one wrong move can unleash death and destruction on a scale that most of us don't even want to imagine. When we hear about these escalations, the bombing of infrastructure, we also need to bring it back home to understand that our substations and our infrastructure are completely exposed. If you've ever been around when a transformer has gone out, you see how it's precariously positioned out in the public, on the street, on the top of a power pole, visible to anyone. The power station just has a chain link fence around it, visible to anyone. Israel had the foresight to put their water system underground in the manner of King Hezekiah, when he brought water past his enemies through tunnels, through aqueducts. Israel's water pumping stations are below ground so that the water infrastructure cannot be subject to attack. These are models for what's going on around the world, of how we in America can shore up our infrastructure and protect ourselves. So we know that in just 13 days, midterm elections take place here. But on November the 1st, elections take place in Israel. This next story, provided by Steve Hendricks, out of Jerusalem. Netanyahu poised for possible return to power, dividing Israel once again. The unusual Israeli government that was formed last June had one job: deprive Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu from the prime minister's office. Netanyahu was clinging to power after 4 inconclusive elections, fighting multiple corruption indictments, and critics say wreaking havoc on Israel's democratic institutions. In stepped the unlikely change coalition of right-wing, left-wing, and Arab parties that agreed on almost nothing but the need to oust Netanyahu and pull Israel out of its spiraling political crisis. It did work. They formed a government, freezing Netanyahu out of power for the first time in 12 years, but it didn't last. A year and a half later, Bibi is back on the campaign trail, along with the political deadlock that paralyzed the country for most of the past 4 years. The new government, while passing a budget and giving Israel something of a respite from political chaos, collapsed after a year of infighting and defections. On November the 1st, Israel will have its fifth election in 43 months, and Netanyahu is right where he was before, angling to win a majority of parliamentary seats for his Likud party and a coalition of extreme right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties. He could do it. Israel's electorate remains split between those who see Netanyahu as the caustic and corrupt prime minister and those who hail him as King Bibi, a savvy Svengali whose only crime is driving his opponents crazy. Polls leading up to the vote suggest that the underlying political dynamic remains much the same. The pro-Bibi and anybody but Bibi camps are neck and neck. We're still a hung country, said pollster Dalia Scheindlin. It's remarkably stable. Predictably, the two sides have opposite views of what a Netanyahu comeback would mean for Israel's future. His critics warn of existential harm to Israeli democracy. Should Netanyahu win this election, Israel will be like Hungary, says Gal Tashir, a political scientist at Hebrew University and the author of a forthcoming book on Netanyahu. This is a very dangerous moment from the point of view of democracy and the rule of law. As Netanyahu's trial on bribery, fraud, and breach of trust indictments unfolds in a Jerusalem court with no verdicts expected for a year or more, he and some of his supporters have waged a scorched earth campaign against the judges and prosecutors involved, some of whom he appointed. His allies support changing the law to prohibit the prosecution of the sitting prime minister. One of Netanyahu's partner factions, the Religious Zionism Party, is running on a platform abolishing the crime of fraud and breach of trust. He wants to disable the judicial system and the critical mediating bodies in Israel, Tashir said. He would like to be the sole ruler. But his supporters celebrate Netanyahu as the leader who modernized Israel's economy, held his own among world leaders, and presided over recent diplomatic breakthroughs between Israel and Arab nations in the Persian Gulf and North Africa. People here understand that he's considered a statesman, said Abe Katzman, a Seattle-born Jerusalem attorney who served as counsel for the Republicans abroad Israel. They understand he is not universally loved by the world's leaders, but he is respected. Under the administration of President Donald Trump, Netanyahu largely based his campaigns on his close relationship with Trump. The two shared a bombastic style. Netanyahu dismisses the charges against him as a witch hunt, and the liberal-conservative divide underlying Israel's political schism is similar to the one affecting the United States. Warnings that Netanyahu would dismantle the rule of law are overblown, Katzman said, and ignore concerns about what conservative Israelis see as a politically motivated prosecution by a court system dominated by a liberal elite. The threat of reform, to put it in American terms, is to the judicial activist wing of the judiciary, he said. As in the previous 4 elections, Netanyahu's faction appears to be hovering just shy of an outright majority of 61 seats in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. And as before, the victor probably will not be known on election night, but only after weeks of jockeying among potential coalition partners. Whether another coalition can emerge to block Netanyahu will depend on the final vote count and the distribution of seats among the 40 parties running. The outgoing Change Coalition, which was assembled by Prime Minister Yair Lapid